Japan's criminal justice system is famous for one statistic: a conviction rate of more than 99%. For many people, that number is a proof of Japanese efficiency. But for critics, it's a proof of something completely different. The case of Iwao Hakamada, who spent decades on the death row in Japan, sits right at the center of the debate of whether the Japanese system is efficient or deeply flawed. Hi, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. I'm Dr. D. I'm a professor and a lawyer. Here at Collectively Vigilant, we learn the law through true crime. So, if you like to hear these kind of stories that are focused on injustice and systematic failure, please consider subscribing to this channel. Today, we will explore the story of Iwao Hakamada, whose relentless fight in Japan forced the Japanese judicial system to confront questions about not only their interrogation system, but also how their entire legal system functions. However, it did take them 6 decades to confront the deep flaws in their system. So, let's start with the story. Before we go into the life of Iwao Hakamada as an adult, let me tell you a little bit of what I've been able to gather about this man. Iwao Hakamada was born in the year 1936 in Shizuoka Prefecture, which is on the coastal southwest side of Tokyo. The area is known for its lush green fields, its fishing ports, and it's also very famous for very, very small family run food industries. Iwao Hakamada was born in an extremely modest working class family. His family background was rooted also in food based small scale industry, where his father was involved in making miso paste, which is almost like salt in Japan. So it's that important. He lived through the entire atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he grew up in Japan, which was recovering from the devastation of the Second World War. Economic opportunities during this time all over Japan were extremely limited, especially for a working class family like the Hakamada family, and especially for a person with modest means like Iwao Hakamada. So, as a young man, without a university education and without any connections to anyone rich, the only life this man could lead was the life of manual labor and factory work. And trying to find his way out of these two jobs, what Iwao Hakamada did was he discovered boxing. And it's this boxing which was his plan to take him out of this life of poverty that they were stuck in. So Hakamada's family was like any other post-war family in Japan. It was structured around extreme hard work, economic survival, and very close familial interdependence. Social mobility was not a privilege that these kind of people had at that point. It was just a life of back-breaking work. He had several other siblings. And one of the siblings that we definitely know of is his elder sister, a woman by the name of Hideko Hakamada, who would later become a very important figure in the fight for justice for Iwao Hakamada. I was not able to find too much information about his parents other than the fact that his father and mother basically ran like a family run miso paste, like a little factory from their own house. And that's all we know about the parents and family background of Iwao Hakamada. However, if Hakamada himself wanted to get out of, this life, so he began boxing. He became what's called a featherweight division boxer. So, as I said earlier, in post war Japan, boxing was not simply a sport, it was often the only escape route that people had from blue collar families to basically get themselves out of that social standing. For young men like Iwao Hakamada, this was his possibility of earning money, of gaining recognition, and that's what Hakamada did. He was quite short, and he was in the featherweight division, which means he was between the category of 52 kilos to 62 kilos. He fought several matches in the 1950s. However, he never rose to any kind of national fame. His career was respectable, but his career was extremely modest. And eventually, by the age of 30, he retired as a boxer. Like many former fighters, he then transitioned to a life of ordinary blue collar work, and he found himself employment in basically as a miso factory worker, something that he had sort of experience with because he had worked like that with his family as well. And miso production, by the way, is a traditional craft of Japan. It involves the fermentation of soybeans and salt in very, very large vats. And the work is extremely repetitive and it's extremely backbreaking. And this is the kind of work which, never really attracts any public attention. However, it is essential work. It's almost like people who make salt. It's the kind of work which is essential. However, none of us ever end up noticing these things. So Iwao Hakamada worked as I said, in a small factory where they were making miso. And it just like in most companies in Japan, when it's such a small company in such a small prefecture, he used to work as a live-in employee. That means, along with his modest wage, he was given like a tiny room where he could live with other people who worked there, and they would share like a common kitchen and a common bathroom, and they would have like a bed of their own to sleep in. His life in this time appears to be very, very quiet, very routine. He worked 6 days a week. However, at this point, of course, as the story is going on, you can definitely tell that there is nothing about this man which, seems like he's going to become controversial later or he's going to be involved in the biggest criminal case of Japanese history. But in the summer of 1966, when Iwao Hakamada was 30 years old, a fire broke out in June of 1966 in the exact location and the exact miso factory where he worked. And you remember he was living in a residence which was actually attached to this miso factory. So the residence, this was, by the way, this is a very common arrangement all around Japan. Small factories attached to like a small hostel where people live and work. So when firefighters came to extinguish this fire, which had not only caught engulfed the whole factory but also parts of the hostel, what they discovered was an absolutely horrifying scene. They discovered that the managing director of the small miso factory, his wife, and two of his children were not only burnt, but before the burning, it seems they were stabbed to death. Their home, it seems, was deliberately torched just to destroy evidence. And then investigators, quickly concluded that robbery must be the motive. And they also concluded that um, the reason why they came to that conclusion that robbery must be the motive is because at this point these kind of small factories, they would keep the money that they were earning inside the house, and it was a cash flow business and everybody knew it. So the police thought that that must be the reason why somebody would come and attack the general manager and his entire family, and they would stab them to death. So the police began questioning people who were close to the manager and his family, and they started with all the employees. And the police, of course, thought that someone who would do such a crime would need to know the exact layout of the property, where to enter, where to exit, so on and so forth. So within days, all of the suspicion fell on Iwao Hakamada. He was a boxer at one point, and this was something that the police thought would make him more prone to violence. He was arrested and accused of murdering his employer's family and stealing money from that house and then setting the entire crime scene on fire. At this point, The case against him was extremely circumstantial, but what happened next would not only shape the history of Iwao Hakamada's life, but also the Japanese judicial system. Now, after his arrest, Iwao Hakamada was interrogated by the police, which is a common tactic used in many countries, but it is rather extreme in Japan. In Japan, during the 1960s, interrogation practices allowed investigators to question suspects for extended periods of time, sessions that would last hours on end, between 10 to 12 hours in one go, up to 20 days. According to Hakamada, the questioning that he received was relentless. He later described his interrogation as lasting 12 hours a day for 3 weeks. During these sessions, he said he was subjected to intense psychological pressure and also physical intimidation. After approximately 20 plus days of interrogation, Hakamada signed a confession letter. Now, the part of the story, of course, this part of the story raises a lot of questions about human rights abuses, but I will answer all those questions for you a little bit later in the legal analysis. But for now, I'll continue with the story. Soon as Iwao Hakamada signed that confession letter, he almost immediately began retracting his entire statement. He insisted that the confession that he had signed was forced out of him because of unbearable pressure. He was interrogated for at least 20 days, 12 hours a day. He said he signed the statement simply to end the interrogations. And despite letting his legal counsel know that he had signed this under intense pressure, he was put on trial. Despite the retraction, investigators now possessed the one thing that they needed, the most powerful thing that they needed as evidence, which is a written confession letter. In Japan, this is the bedrock of the criminal justice system. Still, prosecutors were trying to gather one more piece of evidence, so they waited and they waited for some physical proof. Almost a year later, the police all of a sudden, and the prosecution through the police, began to say that they have found the physical piece of evidence which ties Iwao Hakamada with the killing of the manager, his wife, and two children. This whole time, Iwao Hakamada was already in custody. He was not able to secure any bail. Now, following his arrest, Hakamada, as I said, was interrogated, and it was very, very intense interrogation. And basically, he was not given bail, and he went on trial. Now, the kind of interrogations that go on in many parts of the world are, of course, interrogations are always controversial, because when someone's coerced into giving a statement, that's always controversial. But when it comes to Japan, it is extremely controversial, because the police in Japan can keep you in the jails for an extended period of time without giving you any attorney or any access to the lawyer. So at this point, that's why it's really important to understand that Hakamada's experience is not simply an isolated instance when it comes to the Japanese interrogation system. Aggressive interrogation is part of the broader structural pattern that has drawn sustained criticism from international observers. Japan's criminal justice system has often been described as a hostage justice system. This is a term which is used to capture how suspects who deny any kind of interrogation or allegation may be detained for extended periods of times and subjected to repeated interrogation without any breaks whatsoever. While those who confess are more likely to receive leniency, including the possibility of a bail. And that's the reason why a lot of people under intense pressure write whatever the police wants them to. In such a system, the detention itself, which is, as I said, for up to 22 days, is a tool of psychological and physical pressure. So, the longer the suspect maintains any kind of innocence, the longer the detention lasts, and more powerful the incentive that somebody would just confess to whatever the police wants under intense pressure. This dynamic is, of course, compounded by the fact that historically interrogations were concluded. So, historically in Japan, these interrogations are always done without any lawyer being present, and questions are extended, as I said, over multiple days for several hours per day without any breaks. So, of course, civil liberties organizations and Amnesty International and many human rights groups have repeatedly argued that these conditions create risk of coerced and false confessions, which seems to be what happened in the case of Iwao Hakamada. While the legal framework in Japan formally guarantees the presumption of innocence, critics have always argued that this structure of prolonged detention and confession like investigations can invert the principle of innocence, and it places the suspect in a position where they have to prove their innocence despite the police trying to break them physically and mentally. So, 14 months after the fire, 14 months after the arrest of Iwao Hakamada, the police suddenly announced one day that inside a huge fermentation tank where miso is produced, they have found 5 pieces of blood stained clothing. According to the prosecutor, they said that these garments were definitely worn by the murderer who had come into the house, killed the entire family, and then dumped those pieces of clothing inside the miso tank. They argued that these clothes definitely belonged to Iwao Hakamada, although the defense at that time clearly said that those clothes were basically too small for even for Hakamada's body, although he was a very person of very sort of a slight frame, but it was even too small for him. Nonetheless, this was presented in the court, and then, of course, there were many questions which were raised that how come those pieces of clothing were not found early? And of course, another uh, question for those of us who are familiar with true crime is, if you put a piece of clothing inside a tank of miso, which is a fermented paste basically, what will happen to that piece of clothing over 14 months? Would it even be usable as a piece of evidence? Now, now let me take you to what happened in the trial of Iwao Hakamada. So, in the year 1968, which was 2 years after his arrest, in the Shizuoka District Court, Hakamada's verdict was delivered. He was basically found guilty of murdering the factory owner, his wife, and both the children. He was then sentenced to death by hanging. This conviction rested heavily on just two elements. Number one was his confession, and the other was basically the 5 pieces of clothing that they claimed they had found inside the miso tank after 14 months. The trial occurred in a legal system which is very, very different from what one sees on television. Usually on television, we see the American justice system, which is, you have a jury and you have these passionate attorneys who are pleading the case of their client. However, when it comes to the Japanese criminal trial, it is very, very different. All the judges are, there is no jury. Until quite recently, there was no jury. It's just on a trial basis. They have some juries in some places. It's usually a professional judge. The prosecutors present their case, and then the judges actually evaluate which piece of evidence should go where. As I said, the judges sat in his judgment, and even at that time, when there were these three judges, and one of the judges apparently was not satisfied with the evidence which was presented by the prosecution. However, the other two judges concurred and they agreed with each other, and they said that enough evidence was provided to prove that Hakamada was indeed the person who killed an entire family and then basically set the factory on fire just to hide his crime. And since then, Hakamada was then put on death row in Japan in the year 1968. So, the way the Japanese system works is that the police and the prosecution work very closely and they coordinate, and their central objective is basically interrogation by securing a confession, which carries enormous evidentiary weight inside the Japanese criminal system. And suspects, as I said, can be detained for hours and days on end before a lawyer is ever given to them. Trials are conducted, as I said, by professional judges, and this is typical of a civil law jurisdiction where the judge is basically the judge, jury, and the executioner, as it were. Unlike the American system, which is adversarial system, this is not an adversarial system. This is more a document-driven system, and the defense attorney has a very limited role and ability to change the narrative that the prosecution already has in their mind and which they present to the judges. You can think about it this way, that in Japan, especially in this particular case, it does seem like that the courtroom functioned more like a site of confirmation of Iwao Hakamada's crime or his alleged crime. It was basically not even contested. And then for decades, Iwao Hakamada remained on death row. Now, of course, some of us would say maybe things would have been different had there been a jury in this trial, and maybe so. And actually, as I mentioned a little bit early, Japan since 2009 has started something which is called Saibin-in, which is the lay judges system, where a few ordinary citizens sometimes sit in very serious criminal cases in some trials, but it's basically on a trial basis, and it hasn't caught it's not become a baked in system of the Japanese judicial system. Nonetheless, at least they're trying to make things better now. Now let me take you back to the story of Iwao Hakamada. As I said, in 1968, he was put on death row, and his life was extremely harsh. Death row in Japan is actually characterized by extreme isolation. People are actually always kept in solitary confinement, which most Amnesty International and other civil rights organizations around the world say is the worst form of cruelty. Contact with other inmates inside a Japanese jail for a person who's on death row is extremely limited. Another cruelty that Japan does towards people who are on death row is not something that you see in every country. As a matter of fact, Japan is one of those countries where people on death row do not know what is the day on which people will be executed. So in some countries that's made aware to the person, and then little by little people know when their appeals are up, when they'll actually be put to death. However, in Japan, that's told to the person just hours before their hanging or their killing. For Iwao Hakamada, this meant that waking up every single morning, he had to wonder if that would be the last day that he would survive. And exactly in this limbo, years passed and then decades passed. The psychological toll, of course, you and I cannot even begin to imagine. However, outside Hakamada's jail cell, a lot of people had begun to question how badly he was being treated, because a few times when doctors or somebody else had seen him, they could tell that the psychological toll had been so immense that for long periods of time, and by that I mean months, Hakamada would be absolutely mute. Whenever he did speak, he spoke in fragmented words, and even despite all this psychological toll, whenever he would say something, he would just say that he's not done anything, innocent. And thankfully, the one thing which is very different about Iwao Hakamada is A, he was always saying that he's innocent, and B, he had an elder sister who did not give up on him. While Hakamada was imprisoned for almost 5 decades, almost 50 years, his older sister, Hideko Hakamada, began one of the longest legal advocacy campaigns in Japanese history and also in world history. Hideko herself is not a lawyer. She's not a political activist. She is simply a sister who believed in her brother, and she knew that her brother was wrongly convicted. But year after year, she would walk up to the courts, she would hire attorneys, give her hard earned money to save her brother. However, the judicial system was not willing to let go of Hakamada. Year after year, Hakamada's sister would appeal to the courts that Hakamada should be retried, and there should be forensic testing done on the pieces of clothing that the government claims clearly shows that Hakamada has done this. She began to question the confessions. She brought about so many appeals to the court, and she had the backing of a lot of legal scholars who read through the case of Iwao Hakamada and truly believed that his confession was deeply coerced. Then a breakthrough came in the year 2014. This was nearly 50 years after a Shizuoka district court had already put him on death row. In 2014, he was granted a retrial. There was forensic testing done on his clothing. Then it was proven that the investigation was completely fabricated. The material which the government claimed was crucial had none of his DNA, it had none of his blood group, nothing whatsoever. And Hakamada was able to get a release after 46 years on death row. Once his legal battle was done with the court, it wasn't totally over yet, because there was always this possibility that prosecutors would challenge the decision and put him on trial yet again. However, the final acquittal and happy news for Hakamada and his sister came in September of 2024, when a court delivered the final judgment, and they said that Iwao Hakamada was indeed acquitted, and at the age of 88, after spending 60 years of his life in a legal struggle, he was finally acquitted of all charges. For Hideko Hakamada, the sister, this was an overwhelming moment. This woman never got married, never started a family. She gave up her entire life. Whatever work she did was so that she could pay for the attorneys for her brother and file legal work, paperwork in the courts. So it was a bittersweet thing for both the brother and the sister. At the end, when he was declared innocent, that was the first time in her life that the sister Hideko openly wept. And this is such a profound tragedy, because it's the life of an entire family stolen. Decades of isolation has meant that although Iwao Hakamada is now out of jail, and he, by the way, 10 days ago was his birthday, because I'm recording this in late March of 2026. A few days ago, the gentleman just turned 90 years of age, and this legal ordeal consumed his entire family, and definitely these two individuals, Iwao and Hideko. The justice for the victims of this case, there are so many victims. The 4 people who died, who were murdered, nobody knows who killed them. It was clearly not Iwao Hakamada. At least that has been proven. So the number of victims in this case is immense. You have the 4 victims who died in 1966, and then you have Hakamada and his sister, who till the year 2024 have spent their entire lifetime just trying to prove the brother's innocence. So, these kind of cases, they force society to confront the very human consequences of wrongful conviction and of interrogations which are wrongly done. And imagine, an average Japanese individual does live longer than anyone else. So in this case, this man was at least alive to see himself being freed someday. However, that's not a guarantee in every country around the world, or every genetic pool does not even exist till 90. So this story leaves us with so many questions about the justice system, because here's the Japanese justice system, which, as I started the story, I said it has a 99% conviction rate. However, does that conviction rate come at the price of the lives of people like Iwao Hakamada, where mistakes of the judicial system are hidden from the public? I was looking, when I was researching this case, I even came across a newspaper clipping from 2025. So remember, in September of 2024, the Shizuoka court basically acquitted this man. In 2025, a prosecutor from the same court basically gave a statement saying that she would want to put Mr. Hakamada on trial yet again. And she claimed that she believes that he is guilty. And as a prosecutor, when you say something like that, you are a public figure. So Mr. Hakamada's defense attorneys have actually argued that her remarks are judgmental, okay, and then these remarks are defamatory because the Shizuoka court has already dismissed his the case against him. So they would be filing charges against that particular prosecutor for defamation. Well, let's hope that something comes of it. I should tell you that this is the only gentleman in Japanese history who has also been able to get a generous compensation from the Japanese government for his conviction in this case. And however, that will never make up for the life that he lost, the life that his sister lost, the kind of sadness with which his parents died. It's just such a sad case. However, it is a painful reminder for all of us that when we are not vigilant about what's going on in the legal system in our respective countries, anything can happen right under our noses with our taxpayer money. And that's why being vigilant is extremely important. All right. If you have any thoughts about this case or any other, I have a few other cases of wrongful conviction. I'll link them in the description box below. If you have any comments, please let me know. And until I see you again, stay collectively vigilant.